Good afternoon, everybody. We'll start at the top of the hour, so in just a few moments. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It does appear that we are now at the top of the hour. Thanks for joining us for today's Garris Horn HIT webinar titled Thrive in 2025, Navigating RESPA and Loan Officer Compensation. First, some logistics about this HIT webinar. All participants will be on mute. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to keep introductions very, very short so we can get right into the webinar. First, we have Richard Horn. Rich is a former senior counsel and special advisor in the CFPB's Office of Regulations and the former senior attorney at the FDIC. Rich led the CFPB's design of the TRID disclosures as well as the qualitative and quantitative consumer testing of these disclosures. As a key architect of the TRID rule, Rich is one of the foremost experts on the rule. Finally is Troy Garris. Troy focuses on RESPA, loan officer compensation, fair lending, CFPB enforcement, and mergers and acquisitions. Rich and Troy advise clients on all consumer financial services, regulatory, and enforcement issues. That is our brief introduction of our co-managing partners here at Garris Horn. Troy, why don't you kick us off?
Sure thing. And I'm going to jump right in here. A couple slides just with our contact information and like. We're going to start off on LO Comp, and then we'll go through pretty quickly. It's designed to be in part a conversation. Rich and I talk with a lot of different people about a lot of these different subjects. A lot of LO Comp, a lot of RESPA, and so it's going to be interactive here too. And I have a few slides at the very beginning that's just going to talk about the basics of the LO Comp. We'll share these slides too, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on them. But the LO Comp rule boiled down is two basic requirements. you can divide it up some different ways. There's two basic requirements. One is you can't pay a loan officer, a loan originator, they call it, based on terms of a transaction. And included in the terms of a transaction are proxies for terms of the transaction. And terms are the kinds of things that people would normally think about in the context of a loan transaction. So things like APR, lien position, product type has been defined by the CFPB as a term of the transaction. So these are the types of things that you can't pay a loan officer based on in as a covered transaction. And and the proxy uh, uh, definition is pretty straightforward. It evolved a little bit in 2014 to become a little more clear. There's still a lot of edges that are still unknowns, but a proxy is basically it's something that's not specifically itself a term of the transaction, but some sort of a factor that correlates to terms of a transaction. And the loan originator has the ability to add or remove or change the factor. So any sort of type of a factor that correlates to a term, and then think of it as kind of the LO has the ability to steer either to or from that factor would be a proxy. So that's the first part of the rule is no payment based on terms/proxies. The other side of the rule is no payment that is paid from two different aspects of a transaction. So you can't pay if a consumer pays anything in the transaction, then nobody else can pay. And if anybody else pays in the transaction to a loan originator, then the consumer can't pay. So that's basically it, is that you get paid either from the consumer or by somebody else, but not both. That's the basics of the rule. Again, no terms/proxies, don't get paid from two sources. That's essentially, in a oversimplified nutshell, the LO comp rule. The LO comp rule comes with pretty significant liabilities, and this could be liability for both the companies involved and also for the individual loan originators themselves. They are, we've listed them here, the liabilities, and they're if you think of it as sort of HOPA type liabilities, so high cost loan type liabilities, you're probably in the right queue. In addition, of course, the CFPB has civil money penalty authority, and that's often where the CFPB, if it's enforcing, actually goes. With regard to liability by the actual loan originators themselves, loan originators are liable for up to 3 times whatever they've received for the transactions, if they're violations, the violative transactions. And so if even though we haven't seen specifically enforcement against the LO in a public enforcement action with regard to the LO comp rule, when people are thinking about what's my liability if I'm a loan originator, they should think about, well, how much did you make last year? Because if all those transactions were in violation, then it's 3 times that. And then you have a 3-year statute of limitations too. So could be pretty hefty amounts. And then there's attorney fees and the like. So
Troy, and this is just a liability under TILA, right? Under federal law.
That is right. That is right. So there could be others as well, Rich. Like you want to touch base a little bit on the civil money penalty authority, because that's actually where I think a lot of this goes a lot of times.
Yeah, so this is a liability under TILA, but as some of our listeners probably already know, but thank you, Troy. It's a good idea to cover this as a reminder and as new information for those who don't. The CFPB has pretty broad civil money penalty authority. So if they find a violation and they enforce it in a public enforcement action, they can impose penalties, and there are 3 tiers of penalties. The first is just a kind of a plain vanilla. If there's a violation, they can impose a penalty up to $5,000 a day. If there's a violation that they can say is reckless, then that ups the amount to $25,000 a day. That's the second tier, tier 2. And the highest tier, tier 3, is if the CFPB can say that there was a knowing violation. The company or the LO knew that they were violating the law and they just did it anyway, willfully, essentially. And so that is probably the most drastic civil money penalty authority, and you hear it often cited when people are lamenting the vast authorities of the CFPB. They say, "Oh wow, the CFPB can impose penalties up to," and this is the tier for knowing violations, up to $1 million per day. That's a pretty crazy number, and actually those amounts increase with inflation, so they're even a little higher now. So it's a pretty significant fines that the CFPB can levy if they find a violation. But in addition,
also,
states
yeah,
states
maybe,
enforce
yeah.
federal law, so the states can have their own penalty authority or seek changes to your LO comp program. So this federal liability isn't the only liability you could face for LO comp violations. Sorry,
And
go ahead, George.
often, yeah, no, so I was going to say, often these days in particular, we're seeing states become more active in this sense. And I think also an important facet to remember, this will be true for the RESPA section of this presentation too, but often if there's a violation that the CFPB anyways finds pretty egregious in their view anyways, they go after the individual involved, maybe the senior management, maybe the owner, maybe the president of the company personally as well. And in addition, they sometimes go after people's ability to operate in the business or in the industry or their licenses. So they can turn pretty ugly pretty quickly in that sense.
Yeah, so I think that the message with those different tiers of penalties is, one, don't engage in violations that you know are clearly violations, because that can get you some pretty hefty penalties.
That's right.
Also do your homework, talk to counsel, because you don't want to appear reckless to the bureau. Although the bureau in enforcement context will often throw these higher tiers of penalties around to try and turn up the heat on a target to get a settlement. But if you've done your homework, you've talked to counsel, you don't appear that you've been engaging in reckless activity, that could help in terms of getting a better settlement if you're ever facing an enforcement action.
And I think offline, not here, but offline, it might be interesting to hear some more stories there. I know that you have your own, I have my own, as to how
Right.
this stuff gets tossed around, and happy to chat with people about how that sometimes goes. So let me jump in a little further here. So the supervision and enforcement side, we think of it as sort of exams and investigations boiled down, right? And one thing that people are often thinking about out there is that we're not hearing, and I'll talk about it a little more in a moment. We're not hearing a lot about LO comp violations, at least in the enforcement side, anytime recently. But I will say that investigations and enforcement, they are going on. Exams are going on. The CFPB is thinking about this, and we just have to keep in mind that it's sort of the slow wheels of justice concept, right? They keep turning, and it does take a long time in many respects, but they are happening. And some of the times, especially in the exam side, you may not even ever hear of what is exactly happening. Sometimes they'll put something in the summary highlights that the CFPB puts out, just in sort of aggregated, anonymized kind of fashion. But there are also situations where, in the enforcement context too, you might hear about something, but it may not be specifically this. But I will say that just because somebody comes in and examines, we hear this a lot, well, so and so got examined and they didn't take issue with their LO comp, or for that matter, for the RESPA, when we get to that in a moment. They didn't take issue with this approach, but that doesn't mean necessarily, one, that the CFPB looked at the issue, and two, that they didn't look at it and say, well, we have other things to worry about, not that one right now, or that it's some sort of an endorsement or a condonement of the practice, because that's simply not true. It may just be that different people would have thought of something different. Silence in these exams and even in the enforcement is not any sort of an approval of an approach. So I think people, it could be helpful to know that somebody went in and looked at somebody's system or practice or structure and didn't take issue with it. I mean, it's interesting information, but I don't think people can read into that as well, and therefore it's okay. I just don't think we can go that far. And
yeah, you'll never get.
see that.
You'll sometimes never get the real story anyway, right? Who would want to advertise that they had
That's right.
a bad exam? on LO
Yeah,
comp. So
that's right. That's right. And I will say, I mentioned a moment ago that we haven't had enforcements in a while. So the last big enforcement action that we've seen publicly, anyways, is back in 2015. So that's some time ago now, right? And so those actions, there were three relatively large ones, two very big, and one still pretty substantial, that came out publicly in consent orders. They were in the tunes of I think the smallest one was around 600,000, but the largest was 20 million. And in those actions, two of them at least, they went after, again, not only the company but the specific individual or individuals that were involved, specifically to have those people pay some of those amounts. And so it's something to certainly keep in mind. The rules haven't changed since 2014. There may be some difference in the way that people interpret the rules. There may be some differences in the way that people in both industry and the CFPB, both they look at the risks under the rules, but at least the rule itself hasn't changed. Now there were several, and I've listed them here. There were several instances in the exam highlights where the CFPB sort of hinted at things that they didn't say we're changing the rule. They didn't say that we are doing any sort of formal interpretation, but they did call out these particular items in these summary highlights, and I've listed them there so that people can go back and take a look at them, because the context is important. But the CFPB, I think, is giving some hints as to what it views as how the rules should be interpreted in these summary highlights. And again, I won't go into the details here to save us time, but feel free to go back and take a look at it. You just pull these summary highlights, search for loan originator compensation, and you'll find these items called out. And happy to chat with people about it just offline if they want to talk about it. So
yeah, I think we have a blog post on that last one that you did, and the September
yeah,
2023 one. So you could
that's
also
right.
pull up a blog post.
That's true. That's very true. And that one really is, the CFPB has kind of reversed itself, at least what the industry thought the CFPB's vision or interpretation of this was. And that's the CFPB essentially saying, although the language is not very clear, essentially saying can't pay differently based on whether a loan is brokered out or done as an in-house transaction where the person, correspondent channel, but the language, because of the way that it's written, does raise some questions in some different contexts. But it was important to go out and take a look at those. So let's talk. The rule itself is very unclear and it's amorphous in so many ways. But it does talk about a few things that it believes that the CFPB believes are specifically allowed. So one is the simplest, is a fixed percentage of loan amount. You can pay a fixed percentage of loan amount to a loan originator. That's what most people do in almost every context when they're paying loan originators. They have at least some version of this. So it's 100 bips times loan amount for their commission or for the bonus or whatever. But there's some other ways that the CFPB has said are specifically expressly allowed too. Like you can put a floor, like you won't get paid any less than a certain amount, or a cap, you won't get paid any more than a certain amount, which can help out on the jumbo loans, for example. So let's say my prior example, you get paid 100 bips, but no more than $6,000 on a transaction, or 12,000, or whatever the number is that makes sense for your particular situation. The rule talks to long-term performance of loans. So, if you can devise methods for determining whether the loans perform over time. And that part is, you can read a lot into it or out of that language, but it does talk to that specifically. The rule talks to capture rates. So, for example, the number of applications compared to the number of closings, you could do something along those lines. All of that specifically allowed. Quality of loan files. You got to watch out here, because there's language in the rule that says that you can't, ding a loan officer, so to speak, for errors and insertion of information. For example, on the TRID forms, Rich, that you were so involved in, earlier in your career in particular, but errors there, you can't ding a loan officer for the errors, but the rule talks to quality of loan files and accuracy and completeness and the like. So you got to be careful there, but it does specifically talk to that. And then similarly, like unit and dollar volume, so you can pay more. The rule or the commentary specifically talks about paying one amount for a certain number of transactions and paying a higher amount or a lower amount for subsequent transactions in a particular month or year, something along those lines.
And those errors can happen. I get TRID questions every day,
right?
And many of them have to deal with, oh, the loan officer forgot to put this on, or loan officer did that wrong. So those things can happen.
And so what's the response there? Because people do ask that all the time. So what's a good response to that? That the loan officer put the wrong information into the system, and so they have this error, and they want the loan officer to take the hit for that.
Yeah, from a TRID perspective, obviously the creditor is bound to the disclosure that they generated, and the loan officer's mistake. There's no provision that gives you an out for a loan officer mistake, but you do have certain cures under TRID for tolerance violations, for non-numerical errors, and typos and things. But the creditor would be bound. From an LO comp perspective, like you said, you got to watch out. I'm not, I think probably training and putting more controls in place on in the software is probably all you can do.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it's really based on the best information available at the time, right? And so if the LO makes the error there and it causes the creditor, the employer, money, doesn't mean that this will allow the creditors usually won't allow the creditors to say, well, look, LO, you're going to have to pay for this because you messed up. So I think there's some tension there in the language, but I think it is dangerous to try to push that loss back to the LO in a lot of the situations. And then I've just listed here a number of items that have been coming up recently in particular. And so we won't go through all of these for lack of time, really, but it's sort of a tickler list for people. So the realtor/LO. So this is a big topic recently where people are hiring real estate agents to act as loan originators, and there's a whole array of issues that come up with that. I do believe that there's some risk in it, but there are ways to navigate that people can find a risk tolerance that is acceptable to a lot of companies. But it does raise some LO compensation questions too, in part because what happens is, at least under the old way of doing business, the LO would be getting paid as a real estate agent, arguably, I think it's wrong, but arguably getting paid by the consumer, because the seller, this is pre-NAR settlement, right? The seller paying his or her real estate agent, who in turn shares money with the real estate agent, who is also a loan officer. And so there's arguably a payment, at least indirect, by the consumer there. And then at the same time, a lot of times the LO is getting paid by his or her employer, or if it's a broker, a mortgage broker that is doing the transaction, there's a possibility of a consumer payment that way too. So there are some tricky little areas there. But it's something that is commonly coming up these days. The EMB, so that's the expense management branch. That's a concept that we can. I've gone through this a number of times on these types of presentations, but it's essentially where you have a situation where usually branch manager is getting paid a fixed amount per each loan that comes in, which is fine. If we stop there, it's fine. But then deducting from that non-loan level expenses that the branch manager can pay, and they're things that are not terms of the transaction, so they're not rights or obligations of the parties. So things like rent of the space that the person is in, or things like the wages of other people that work within the branch. They're not really terms of a transaction, so there's a pretty good argument that those are acceptable as deductions. And we can go into more details on that if needed. Concessions is a hot topic. So there's always the question coming up about, can we somehow in any way make the LO responsible for concessions, lowering fees, lowering prices, rates to the consumer? And the answer is usually not. There are some very minor type of situations where you might have an argument there, but I wouldn't do that in the normal course. And again, there's an array of items here that I don't want to take up the whole conversation on, because I think we got to get to some good RESPA context. And then I think the big one here is what about the DOGE, the change in administrations coming in? What will happen there? And we should probably do an entire webinar on that coming up here soon. Once we get in, there will be almost undoubtedly a new head of the CFPB, and that will bring probably some relatively big changes, at least in the way that this is viewed. Does it mean the deletion of the CFPB, like some of the press has been talking about, and have some comments by some people involved in the DOGE? It remains to be seen. I think I wouldn't plan on that. It would be interesting if it happened, but I certainly wouldn't plan on that. And then I'm just going to hand off, Rich, so that we have time.
Yeah. Well, just to comment on your last point, I think there's been legislation every year since the CFPB was created to get rid of the agency, and it's just never gone anywhere since the CFPB was created. So it's unlikely to happen. Plus, all of these federal authorities that the CFPB has, there's a lot of questions about what would happen to them if you got rid of the CFPB. Do they go to another agency? Do they just go away? And now, all of these markets that weren't federally regulated before are now non-federally regulated in the future. And how would that work with, what some would describe as a more populist agenda of the new administration? So there's a lot of questions about that. But we could do another webinar on that. On RESPA, this is going to be the RESPA lightning round. Some things to just keep in mind to help you thrive in 25. Keep an eye on the CFPB's RFI on mortgage closing costs. As you might remember, there was a news report, or maybe a couple news reports earlier this year in the spring, that the CFPB was going to put in place a ban on lenders charging borrowers for lenders' title insurance, and that there was going to be some kind of RFI as a prelude to that rulemaking to create administrative record for the rulemaking. And then, a couple months later, this RFI came out in May of this year. And the RFI did talk a lot about what the CFPB finds problematic with mortgage closing costs in general. And so it looked like the CFPB wasn't just thinking about title insurance, but other aspects with respect to closing costs, like the level of itemization on the forms, which, as we mentioned, I led the TRID rule when I was at the CFPB, so I know a lot about the move from the old, the revised GFE, which had a more lump sum approach, to the itemization that's on the loan estimate closing disclosure. There's a lot of consumer testing that went into that decision to go towards the itemization route, but the CFPB seems to be rethinking that. CFPB was also interested in the increases in credit report fees that we've seen. They're also interested in origination fees and discount points, and saying, well, borrowers really don't understand what discount points are all about. They don't understand what they're paying for. And then they did comment on, in the RFI, title insurance and settlement services. And so it's a big question mark about what happens now that we're going to have a change in administration. Does the CFPB try and get a proposed rule out on mortgage closing costs before the change? And, if they did have a proposal, what would happen to that? There are some areas that actually a new administration, might not disagree with the CFPB on looking at, like, credit report fees and other issues that might, like I said before, might be viewed as a more fitting with a more populist agenda. But there are other areas that were kind of more problematic from an industry perspective. And the reason why I talk about it in this RESPA section is there are some comments in the RFI about that kind of make one think that the CFPB is thinking about bundling of closing costs again, requiring or at least allowing lenders to bundle different settlement service fees and other closing costs together into one fee. Again, they didn't like itemization. There's some comments about how borrowers might not have essentially the competitive advantage that lenders do in shopping for closing costs. So that's something to look out for in a proposal. Obviously, that would implicate RESPA and RESPA Section 8. The other issues are, does the CFPB have a proposal that has a theory that charging certain fees could be a UDAP violation? And does that analysis also affect the potentially other fees that might be charged? So there's things to look at if the CFPB does move forward with a proposal here. Also, there's legal issues. What legal authority would they use to, for example, ban lenders from charging for title insurance? So there's a lot to be seen with this potential proposal, even if including whether they even issue it. So that's just kind of a keep an eye on this.
And we are down to 2 minutes, Rich, just as a heads
Okay.
up.
10 seconds per slide. Here we go. Next, digital mortgage. Oh, this is going to be a hard one because the name that the Bureau chose for these is really difficult. Digital mortgage comparison shopping platforms, DMCSPs. The only way I can remember that is by thinking of Run DMC. But basically, the point of this discussion on these next couple of slides is that the CFPB seems to be interested in how lenders and maybe other settlement service providers are advertising on like online shopping websites, so online comparison websites and the like, and they're looking at how that information is being displayed on those sites, whether some lenders are being favored over others, and then also thinking about what the lenders are actually paying for, the compensation structures, and there's so it's worth looking at your agreements with different online marketplaces to see whether you're complying with this advisory opinion. Let's move on to the next. There's a lot more to say about that. So if you have questions, reach out. They also address this issue in a circular from this year, 2024-01. But this is from a UDAP perspective. So it's broader than just mortgage. And they basically say, look, if these online marketplaces are saying, look, we have expertise in this area, and so we're ranking all of these providers for you, that's kind of creating a setup where there could be an abusiveness violation, violation of UDAP under the abusiveness prong, because what the website's doing is kind of taking advantage of the consumer's reliance on the website, but then not neutrally listing providers and maybe listing providers higher that pay them more. So that can these kinds of agreements can create also a UDAP violation in addition to RESPA. And let's move on to the next slide. CFPB and HUD RESPA guidance. Okay, CFPB end of 2023 basically put out this notice that said, hey, industry, we're following all the old HUD policy statements from the 90s. And it wasn't a surprise, but I guess the surprise was that the CFPB put out this notice. It wasn't expected. And I think this is something that maybe we should keep an eye out for change in a new administration, because RESPA is an area where there could be significant regulatory reform. The Mortgage Bankers Association has been pushing for that reform. They put out a white paper on it, and a lot of these old HUD policy statements are in need of updating. They're decades old now. So this is an area to look out for, whether there's actually regulatory reform under RESPA. Let's move on to the next couple slides. So CFPB, as we mentioned before, isn't the only agency that enforces consumer finance laws. States do, but also the federal banking agencies do as well. The FDIC has had a number of RESPA enforcement actions. The reason why I include some of these in these slides is that it shows what the FDIC has been interested in. In addition to kind of plain vanilla RESPA violations, they do in their recent RESPA enforcement actions talk about the advertising that was being done on online and digital platforms. So this is an indication that kind of this online marketing on these websites is something that the agencies, all the agencies are looking at, not just the CFPB. And maybe that was one of the reasons the CFPB put out the advisory opinion, because it's something all the agencies had been seeing.
And some of them
And
take different approaches. Isn't that right, Rich? Like FDIC's interpretation, even though they generally lean to follow CFPB, sometimes I've seen them come up with sort of different interpretations.
yeah, it's possible, because you're dealing with personnel at these agencies, and whether you get to the point where the personnel are running every single string of their theory by the CFPB, that might not happen in all cases. So it's
Right.
possible they could have a different interpretation. But do you push it, or do you just try and settle it, or do the corrective action the agency wants you to do to make it go away?
Right.
Is a question that institutions need to answer in the specific fact pattern they're dealing with. Let's move to the next slide. The CFPB's most recent RESPA enforcement action was from 2023, but this is an indication that the CFPB staff, they are still looking at RESPA. They didn't look at RESPA for a long time because of their probably because of their loss in the PHH case in the DC Circuit, but they are still looking at RESPA, and their FAQs that they put out on their website on RESPA Section 8 are also an indication that the staff is at the CFPB is still interested in RESPA. In this enforcement action, there are some things that you would say, okay, well, it looks pretty clear that there were issues that garnered the attention of the CFPB, and could plausibly be described as a violation of RESPA Section 8. Again, these consent orders are drafted by the CFPB. 99.9% of the time, there's not input from the institution on what's in the consent order. So take it with a grain of salt. But a lot of the stuff that was described, you could say, those are things that we should pay attention to, make sure we're not doing. Or you could say, look, it's clear that these are plausible RESPA Section 8 violations. I think I would also encourage you to look at the concurrent enforcement action against the real estate brokerage that was involved
True.
in this situation, because that has more detail. Kind of an interesting little tidbit about these enforcement actions is CFPB. They're talking about some of the entertainment that was going on and how it was targeted to the real estate brokerages that were giving the mortgage company referrals. But then the CFPB always seems to mention, oh, and there was alcohol at the event. They seem to not like alcohol. So if you're doing an event, I know we're nearing the holidays, but if you're having a dry January, it might be good for RESPA compliance, let's just say. DC, yeah, the DC. Okay, I'm a little over it, but I'm going to quickly mention the DC AG enforcement actions based on joint ventures in DC. These were joint ventures that title companies set up with real estate agents, and there's definitely a plausible theory that's allowed under RESPA Section 8. There's nothing in RESPA Section 8 that says you cannot, expressly prohibits having an ABA with a real estate agent. But the DC AG, in their settlements, called out some things that they found problematic. Some are interpreting these enforcement actions as saying you cannot do any ABA with real estate agents in DC anymore. But if you look at the settlements, there's like specific language that talks about how the real estate agents were offered discounted ownership interests, that the ownership interests were based on past sales volume, that there were no capital contributions required from the real estate agents. So those are things that, if you're looking at RESPA compliance, maybe you want to avoid those things because it wouldn't really be the most conservative way to comply with that old HUD policy statement on ABAs, which is, as the CFPB mentioned in their notice, is still in effect. So I think there's a couple ways of looking at these DC AG enforcement actions. One of the things to think about, though, is the states and the district are still in the game, and especially if there's a change in administration at the CFPB, which there will be. There'll be a new director of the CFPB. There's still the possibility of state enforcement and enforcement by DC. And also, one thing that we saw, this is an important reminder, when administration changed last time, the first Trump administration, we had former Director Kraninger, who was actually, she had a pretty active enforcement docket at the CFPB. Now, she wasn't enforcing against the big players as much as Director Chopra has been. And a lot of the enforcement actions were against the smaller players, but maybe that's because they want to avoid hitting potential donors with enforcement actions. That'd be a smart move, but I think that it is an indicator that just because you have a Republican appointed director of an agency doesn't mean that the agency just stops doing anything, especially in the area of consumer protection. I think nobody wants to have press saying they're not protecting consumers, they're throwing consumers under the bus, and I think especially with the more like I said before, populist, seemingly populist, potentially populist agenda of the Trump administration. Remember during the campaign, he talked about limiting credit card interest rates. Those kinds of ideas, I think, fit with consumer protection. And so I don't think it's a guarantee that there'll be no more enforcement by the CFPB, but I do think the states will up their enforcement activity as well to kind of fill the gap. Like last time, we saw a lot of state mini CFPBs, as they were being called at the time, created. And so I think enforcement is still something to keep in mind. Keep in mind the things that we just talked about, which are indicators of what the agencies are interested in, and that will help you thrive in 25.
Yeah, we went a little bit over, guys, and so thanks for everybody who could stick around. We will circulate these. Again, we do this purposely, quickly, so that people can get on with their day and back to their regular activities. But if you have any questions, of course, always happy to just chat on the phone or however you want to go through any of this. And Shauna, thank you. You want to take it back and wrap up?
Thanks so much. Yes, we will get the slides out by the end of the week, so keep an eye out for those. And thanks all for joining. We'll see you next time.
Happy holidays, everybody.